Welcome everyone to the Hoover Institution workshop on using text as data in policy analysis. My name is Stephen Davis. I organized the workshop with Justin Grimmer. Today we are absolutely delighted to hear from two Hoover Fellows, Erin and Brett Carter. Both are also professors in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at USC. The title for their talk today is Propaganda in Autocracies: Institutions, Information, and the Politics of Belief. It's a fascinating and important topic, and even more so in light of recent actions by Russia and China. So we're super excited to hear from them. Here's the format today. Erin and Brett will speak. I think Erin's going to handle most of the speaking duties here for about 35 minutes. And then we'll turn things over to discussion and Q&A. If you have a question or comment, put it into the Q&A box, which Justin and I will moderate. And depending on the flow of questions and comments, we may combine questions, paraphrase, or ask you to state your remarks directly. Now, we'll run this first part of the seminar, and this part's recorded, just keep that in mind, for about 75 minutes. And after that, we'll turn off the recording and we'll continue with a more informal discussion for anyone who wants to stick around. Okay, Erin, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stephen, Justin, for having us here. It's a real pleasure to talk about our book out later this year with you all. So let me share our screen here. Okay, fantastic. So this is our first book project that we're going to talk about today about propaganda in autocracies. So this book was motivated by a comparison by the two countries that we study. Brett is an expert on the Republic of Congo, and I study China. And the propaganda strategies of these two countries could not be more different. In Congo, here you can see President Denis Sassou Nguesso, who has ruled Congo for all but 5 years since 1949. He is extraordinarily corrupt. He has more than 30 homes in Paris. Here are those homes. Some of Paris's finest is real estate. Congo is also one of Africa's leading oil producers. Despite this status, it still has oil shortages because of the immense corruption among senior officials. Despite that corruption, what's interesting about Congo's propaganda strategy is that it's remarkably forthcoming. So here you can see a state-run media outlet acknowledging that there is a fuel shortage that's caused by the government and customers are lining up early in the morning to get gas. China's propaganda strategy is worlds apart. So here you see the People's Daily, China's flagship propaganda apparatus. It's common to see things like this in the People's Daily, that President Xi Jinping's contributions to diplomacy have transcended 300 years of Western IR theory. Wherever he goes, Xi Jinping sets off a whirlwind of charisma. So you see this effusive, almost ridiculous praise of the leader. So the question that motivates this book is, why do autocrats employ such dramatically different propaganda strategies? Our argument that we'll try to convince you of today is that autocrats use propaganda for fundamentally different reasons based on the electoral constraints they confront. So citizens are uncertain about two things, right? Broadly speaking, in comparative politics, especially in autocracies. First is the performance of the regime, whether it's providing public goods for citizens or not. The second is whether the regime can credibly repress citizens with state violence. And we argue that autocrats employ propaganda to shape citizens' beliefs about both of these topics. We see these two worlds, right? So in a world where autocrats can fully secure themselves with repression. So think about China, I'm talking about the right panel here on the screen, where those electoral constraints are not binding. Autocrats' incentive is to make their capacity for repression common knowledge among citizens. Propaganda in this case is a low-cost signal of their capacity for violence. They use propaganda as a signal to show citizens that their power doesn't rest on citizens' support and on the threat of violence. And this is Orwell's classic 2 + 2 = 5 world. In contrast, in the presence of binding electoral constraints in a world like Congo, in this case, autocrats are first forced to curry some amount of public support. Although they can secure elections to some extent with fraud, elections do pose a real threat, and they do need to provide public goods to curry citizen support. Consequently, because they do provide some genuine public goods, this creates an opportunity for them to use propaganda to mix facts with useful fictions. In this case, propaganda exploits the fact that autocrats are required to provide public goods sometimes in order to create useful fictions at other times. We call this world that of honest propaganda. In order to persuade citizens of regime merits, they occasionally concede policy failures like the fuel shortages in Congo. This does occasionally create focal points for mass protest, but nonetheless, that's the world that these autocrats live in when they confront electoral constraints. Honest propaganda for them is an investment in making actual propaganda work. So to test this theory, we built a data set of propaganda newspapers across the world. We looked at the media environment of every country with a team of fantastic RAs at the University of Southern California and determined whether there was a state-run newspaper in existence. In green, you can see all the state-run newspapers that are in our data set, and in red, the ones that are not in our data set. We gathered the corpus of around 80 newspapers from 70 countries, some 8 million articles, in all the world's major language groups. We use a variety of text techniques to identify all the references in these documents to the incumbent presidents and the ruling party. We achieved very high accuracy with this, around 85%. I'm happy to talk in Q&A about all the technical details of this. And then for every reference to the incumbent or ruling party in each article, we then measure the positive and negative valence of the 20 words surrounding the reference to the executive. And from that, we computed a key metric, which is positive coverage standardized. So this is essentially how positively that newspaper is covering the incumbent executive or ruling party, and we're standardizing by the number of references. This measure conceptualizes propaganda fundamentally as spin, right? So editorial bias, how positively you're talking about a leader or the ruling party, not lies as in actual objective falsehoods, which would be difficult to measure in this sort of big data type of project. We have a second way that we measure propaganda, which is not focusing on specific references to the leader, which are very specific and tailored, but rather broad article level measures. So to do this, we sort of looked at all of these articles and we used within language groups supervised learning methods to label all of the topics in a given article. You can see our list of potential topics here. We're very broad. And then we use these models to train the data and sort of label all the other articles in our corpus. We had sort of 90% accuracy and very good performance also on precision recall curves, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. But what we're looking at here is the topic label in bold there, government action. So this is discussion of the government and what it's doing in any article. And with that, we computed our second important measure of how the government is being covered, which is article valence. So it's standardized, so how positively that article is covering whatever topic is at hand. So this is our sort of big takeaway, sort of in a descriptive sense. We have two plots here. The first is our measure of executive tone, standardized, and on the right, we have article valence. And what we find, so on the x-axis here is polity, which is a very standard measure of democracy and democratic institutions in political science, where the left is a pure autocracy and the right is a pure democracy. And on the y-axis is our two propaganda outcome variables. And what we find is that electoral constraints become more binding, i.e. as you see more democracy, you see the propaganda quickly moderates. That's sort of something that we see across countries and across language groups. So our estimating equations to look at this in a more sort of rigorous fashion is, so first we use a number of country year level models where we're using country fixed effects and clustered standard errors. We also use country article level models where we're using country and language fixed effects. Our vector X here is sort of our most important explanatory variable. We use a series of different types of variables that political scientists like to use to measure democracy, such as polity or things from the VDEM project. Our annual and day level or article level covariates are things like internet penetration, whether an election season is currently going on, the number of natural resources in a country, education, ongoing civil wars, openness to trade, economic development, also references to the political opposition, which we computed in the same way that we discussed earlier. So by regime type, our results are pretty stark. So if we break out regimes in sort of a standard partition, democracies, dictatorships, and two types of constrained autocracies, where sort of our representative countries are Argentina being quite democratic, constrained autocracies like Russia, constrained autocracies that are sort of more repressive like Tunisia, and true dictatorships like China. What we find is that there is this sort of strong pattern where you do see more positive coverage in democracies. Our key insights here are, as our theory predicts, in dictatorships, we see absurd propaganda that's intended to intimidate, not to persuade. In worlds where we see weakly binding electoral constraints, instead we see concessions of regime failures, which may create focal points for protest. So the policy implication of this finding is that we do see, excuse me, I'm gonna move this bar, pressuring autocrats to abide nominally democratic institution leads them to concede regime failures like that fuel crisis, and that does create these opportunities for collective action. This suggests that policy or democracy promotion is an important way that the United States or the international community could help citizens access more honest news and sort of allow them to sort of organize on their own behalf. So the major first threat to inference in this project is that of reverse causality, namely the idea that propaganda itself might weaken electoral constraints. So the idea here is that maybe Sassou Nguesso could be more like Xi Jinping if he simply employed more propaganda. To test that, we look at one exogenous change that was very important, the fall of the Berlin Wall. In Africa, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the cessation of Soviet support, you saw that democracy swept the continent. Here you can see in 1985, in sort of light blue, you had a lot of single party regimes that really sort of switched to nominally democratic institutions and democracies only 10 years later. So in particular, we look at one country, Gabon. Here you see its leader, Omar Bongo, who ruled for a very long time. In 1990, conceded reforms. This is what he said about the Berlin Wall, that the winds from the east are shaking the coconut trees. It might be the case that the ruling party controls the government, but the opposition controls the streets. So the Berlin Wall, in his view, was creating this marked, sudden political change. We were able to obtain this incredible propaganda archive dating back to the 1970s, these PDFs of the state-run newspaper. And what we're able to ask with this corpus is, did you see a change in propaganda after the fall of the Berlin Wall? So the first way we look at this is to digitize this corpus and to look at changes in positive coverage standardized, namely how Bongo and his ruling party is covered after the fall of the Berlin Wall. You do see this large shock when you see the trend with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So you do see a sharp decline thereafter. The second thing we do is to adopt Bayesian change point models to ask more inductively, when was it? So when does the model identify a time where the data generating process for propaganda changed? It identified 2 points, and they're really interesting and substantively important. The first is in September 1990, which were the first multi-party elections in Gabon since 1967. And the second change point was in March 1990 when Bongo announced a major electoral conference for the next few months. So we do see this really interesting change in propaganda strategies that are located with various important substantive moments. So the second threat to inference in our book is a very important and well-known alternative explanation, which is kind of something like a modernization theory of information, which is the idea that as citizens have more access to information and they become better educated, this, as consumers, this fundamentally constrains propaganda over the long run. So to look at this, we turn to China's People Daily. We have the propaganda archive going back to 1946, even before the founding of the PRC. And this is a huge corpus of around 3 million articles. And what we find, so maybe first we can look on the right hand, these are all the this is the sort of visualization of China's economic miracle, right? So you can see in red, GDP per capita, in blue, China's trade intensity, in green, urbanization, in yellow, internet per capita, and in purple, tertiary education. And you can see this is the miracle where, Chinese citizens were lifted out of poverty and everyone becomes more affluent and more educated and there's more information. What's interesting is despite these shocking economic changes, the propaganda strategies did not diminish, right? So you can see on the left-hand panel, This is a history of China's propaganda in the People's Daily since 1946. And what you can see is it corresponds to political trends, right? So propaganda rises steadily under Mao, reaches a high during the Cultural Revolution. Deng had a short-term sort of reset of propaganda, but it drifted up thereafter. And today, under Xi Jinping's China, the People's Daily is just as propagandistic as it was during the height of the Cultural Revolution. So really, there's very little evidence over the sort of long historical period that these major and important changes in economics and in information access have created a major change in China's propaganda strategy. This is even true if you look at China's commercial press. So a major argument in the China politics literature is that you'll see more balanced coverage in the commercial press, leading to more balanced coverage in the political press. And what we find on the left-hand panel here, this is looking at a number of China's most important commercial outlets. You do see that they're more objective or more neutral in their coverage overall. But on the right-hand panel, if you look at their coverage of politics, it's almost identical to that which is in the People's Daily. So you do see in these important issue areas where the People's Daily and the regime is signaling violence in the state's repressive capacity, you do see that it maintains power over time. So to test how this propaganda works in a more repressive autocracy, we fielded a survey experiment in China. The conventional wisdom, based partly on this commercial press literature, is that CCP propaganda is actually persuasive. People read it and believe it and buy it. This is related to a very large study or large literature in the China political literature that finds that there are over 90% approval ratings for the regime if you ask citizens in direct questions. One very famous study has been run several times out of the Ash Center at Harvard. This is asking Chinese citizens in direct questions, do you support the regime? How well do you think the regime is doing? And it finds that 95.5% of Chinese citizens are satisfied with Beijing's government. In contrast, it's only 38% in the United States. This is very often parroted on CCTV propaganda in China. So here you can see China Daily saying that Harvard study finds that Chinese citizens' satisfaction with their government rises. So to test whether this is really the case, we fielded a nationally representative survey in China. The treatment group received pro-regime propaganda from the People's Daily, and the control group received nothing. We then use list experiments, which are a technique in political science to elicit more honest responses. So rather than directly asking someone a sensitive question, you ask them how many statements you agree with, and then you compare the difference in means to how many people answered, X number of things in group A versus group B. And that allows you to assess in your survey sample true support for things without asking people to, directly say a sensitive opinion. So what we find in using this list experiment method is that CCP propaganda is not persuasive. It doesn't convince people that the regime is performing or providing public goods. So there's no effect of CCP propaganda in the People's Daily on support for Xi Jinping, on whether people believe that the CCP government is working for the people, whether they think that China's system of government more broadly is best. The one thing that CCP propaganda does do is intimidate citizens, right? So here we ask citizens, our list experiment treatment was saying that I would not protest because I'm afraid of the consequences of doing so. So there we find that CCP propaganda does have this intimidating effect, but not any of the persuasive effects that other parts of the literature expect. So two more key insights about this briefly. So we should, take preference falsification more seriously. That's a big implication of our work that sort of is contra large literature based on direct questions in China. The rest of the book, I want to sort of take a few selections from it in the time remaining to cover. So we apply the theory to a range of different propaganda contexts. We look at domestic propaganda. We look at propaganda about the foreign affairs. We look at threats specifically. We look at the calendar of propaganda and how the propaganda apparatus just tries to sort of omit or cause citizens to forget sensitive topics. And in particular, we try to estimate the effect of propaganda on protest rates more broadly. But one thing I want to sort of briefly focus on is the calendar of propaganda that we identify. So here, this is just a simple reference count of how often the incumbent government is referenced in red compared to the opposition. So all opposition figures and political parties in blue. And we see, and so this graph shows you the number of days till election day and sort of the middle of the plot before and after. So what we find is that in dictatorships, you see virtually no references to the political opposition, right? So, but lots of references to the dictator. And you see that spike as sort of election seasons approach. So in constrained autocracies, you see that there's nearly balanced coverage of the dictator and the political opposition. So maybe there's some bias, and in democracies, it's very even. So what's interesting here is you do see that essentially a little bit of democracy becomes very helpful and very binding quickly on dictators' information strategies. And this is also the case if you look at this instead of references, we're looking now at positive tone standardized. And you see quickly the dictatorships rarely cover the opposition, and they're covering the dictator very positively, and that evens out very quickly as you move towards a constrained autocracy and democracy group. One other thing I want to focus on, since it's been in the news a lot lately, is how Russian propaganda talks about foreign affairs. So this is from Rossiyskaya Gazeta, which is the Russian main propaganda newspaper that speaks to Russian citizens. And what we find here is that a major theme in coverage, and so to produce these graphs, to back up for a second, we used a supervised learning model to label all the topics in Russia's foreign affairs coverage. And then we took those topics and we created network graphs of their linkages, right? So how often these topics are co-occurring in articles. And what we find is that major themes in Putin's coverage of international affairs include the decline of the liberal order, the failure of the West to realize democratic ideals, different flaws of democracy, economic crises across the West, civil unrest in democracies. Terrorism is a major theme, owing in part to the European migration crisis at the time. And especially Trump and the European far right is emblematic of sort of problems of unrest and flaws in democracy. So by contrast, we also looked at Chinese propaganda coverage of international affairs. For reference, that in Russia is more multilateral. You can see this for the network graph, touching on lots of different countries, lots of different topics. In contrast, China covers foreign affairs in a very different way, right? It covers itself as a rising hegemon with these bilateral ties to a lot of different individual countries, which is really crafting a new international order. So you see economic cooperation at the center of this network as sort of the organizing principle of China's bilateral affairs with a lot of different countries. So what's also interesting is that in terms of being an architect of that new world order, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is referenced just as often as the UN. So you do really see sort of a move towards a new bilateral Chinese-led multilateral order, which is a lot less chaotic than the one that Russia envisions. So why this matters, we believe that understanding what repressive governments tell their citizens gives us an understanding into the internal dynamics of the regime. So another related thing I want to highlight is in China, right? So our other related work finds that there's an important calendar of protests in China. So Chinese citizens still remember many of China's failed democracy movements and still protest on the anniversaries of those days, something that we wrote about in the New York Times a couple years ago. So what we find in that related work is that those anniversaries motivate protests today. And also motivates more CCP repression, right? CCP is especially likely to repress protests that emerge on pro-democracy anniversaries in China. We looked in this related work at the demands of those protesters. So you can see there's this wonderful database of protests in China, the China Labor Bulletin. So we got all of these around 35,000 images of these protest banners and demands. So here you can see a banner that says the government works for me and is signed by all the protesters. And we OCR'd those documents to sort of see what Chinese citizens were protesting about. And what we found is that on these democratic anniversaries, Chinese citizens are indeed demanding more democratic government. So this is using a distinctiveness algorithm to show what protesters are demanding on those pro-democracy anniversaries. And what we find is that they're demanding political change. They want a new world. They want a right to know what their government is doing. They're talking about netizens, which is sort of a code word for politically active internet users. They're referencing people power teachers, which is a phrase used to describe protest organizers. And they're demanding court enforcement of Chinese law. And discussing also the government's bad faith efforts and feeling helpless. So this is sort of suggestive that Chinese citizens are demanding this more democratic government on the anniversaries of failed democracy movements in the past. And so in our book, sort of, we wanted to ask, sort of as a consequence of this work, how does the CCP respond to this calendar of citizen protests? What does it use propaganda to tell citizens during these sensitive anniversaries when mobilization is more likely? What we find is that it depends. On most pro-democracy anniversaries, you don't see a lot of coverage of the political events, no changes in propaganda strategies, and we argue that that is a way to try and make citizens forget. There's one exception, which is the Tiananmen Anniversary. So Tiananmen was the sort of largest protest movement in Chinese history, certainly the most significant, and it's essentially too important to forget. Everyone knows about it in China. And we find that around that sensitive anniversary that's so charged, the CCP uses an interesting strategy of scapegoating the ethnic Uyghur minority group and talking about its repression in that group in order to elicit compliance among the Han in-group in China. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how that works. So just briefly, who are the ethnic Uyghurs? They're based in Xinjiang, a far western region of China. They're distinct from the ethnic Han majority, which constitutes the political in-group. They speak the Uyghur language and they practice Islam typically. There's, this has been going on for quite some time in the news, but there has been agreement across different US administrations that what is going on in Xinjiang probably constitutes genocide. This movement started around 2009 when there was a major riot in the capital of Xinjiang province, where you had around 10,000 protesters, which is the largest riot actually since Tiananmen at the time, protesting against CCP rule. Currently, of around China's 11 million Uyghurs, around 3 million are in detention in facilities that the US compares to concentration camps. You can see a few pictures of these, as well as here's location of some of the camps. And you can see with satellite imagery, the construction of these has proceeded rapidly in the last several years. And the policies are very repressive as well. And you can see there's even been a campaign of murals. So there are murals painted by the government all across Xinjiang province or Xinjiang region. And you can see, so here you see a bulldozer with the CCP flag crushing the alleged Uyghur resistance. So this is a dramatically repressive and draconian campaign. So to look at how CCP propaganda instrumentalizes this repression in Xinjiang, we tracked coverage of Xinjiang and the Uyghurs in the People's Daily. What we found is that before the 2009 uprising, coverage of those issues was pretty random and sporadic in the CCP. What we found was that after the uprising, coverage of those issues really clustered into a few important moments. So in yellow, these spikes are all important nationalist holidays in China. And in red, you see the Tiananmen Anniversary, June 4th. So what we argue is that you see sort of the Uyghurs being scapegoated and the Uyghur threat trotted out at these sort of moments that are especially salient for domestic stability in China among the political Han in-group. This is sort of part of a broader literature identifier sort of kicked off by Haifeng Huang about social stability maintenance in China. It's a very well-defined concept that's code for maintaining the stability of the regime. So this is what that sort of propaganda looks like. In red, it talks about the terrorism in Xinjiang and how the CCP is taking a heavy hand and making a heavy punch to fight the enemy and quash the arrogance of the terrorists and the separatists. This is all about maintaining local stability. You see the massive deployment of CCP troops. What's interesting is that propaganda strategy is something that's specific to the People's Daily, right? The flagship newspaper that targets the urban elite. We don't see that emerge at all in China's commercial press. So we do see this pattern where you do see on the anniversary of China's most sensitive moment for the political in-group, the CCP broadcasts its power to repress and what it's doing in Xinjiang in order to the urban Han elite. We understand this as a threat. To confirm that this works as we expect, we fielded another survey experiment in China that was nationally representative. We fielded it during June 2020 to coincide with the special charged moment of the Tiananmen Anniversary. Our treatment was an article previously published by the People's Daily about Uyghur Tiananmen content, and the control was nothing. and overcome the problem of preference falsification, we employed a list experiment. So what we find is very interesting. So if we focus specifically on the urban elite that we sort of isolate in our survey through PCA methods, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, what we find is that of those politically engaged urban elite individuals, that Uyghur propaganda causes them to become much less likely to protest because they fear state repression. So we do see this really interesting and important response where the people who are most likely to protest, the politically engaged, educated urban elite, those are the people who respond the most to CCP propaganda about its repression in Xinjiang. So this contributes to our understanding more broadly. There's a lot of writing about why the CCP is doing this. Ian Johnson, a very famous observer of China, says he doesn't understand why this is happening because this is morally wrong, is self-defeating. Victor Scher, a very well-known expert of Chinese politics, argues that it's hard to understand why this is going on. Perhaps it's because someone is getting rich, sort of the people operating the camps are sort of financially benefiting. So our view is that while there may be many reasons that this repression is going on, one way that the regime has instrumentalized it is to use it as a strategy to pacify the political in-group at the time on June 4th, when its mobilization against the regime is most likely. So more broadly, what we argue is that repressive governments, what they tell their citizens, helps us understand the internal dynamics of the regime. In dictatorships, we see absurd propaganda being used as a signal of the capacity for repression of those groups. In constrained autocracies like Congo, we see that the propaganda apparatus is more likely to concede regime failures, and that provides a focal point for protests. That's all. That's a summary of our book project. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to discussion and Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. That was great. Let me probe you on one aspect of your overall thesis, which I'm sure you get a lot of pushback on, which is you downplay the role of the informational environment as something that influences the way regimes conduct their propaganda. And I don't mean to take away from the kind of arguments you put forth, but some aspects of the Chinese government strategy don't seem fully aligned with that view. So 2 examples, one kind of a simple basic one. If I go to a 5-star hotel in Beijing or Shanghai, at least the times I've been there, you can't find a Wall Street Journal. Now, why is that? It doesn't seem like, you need to make the Wall Street Journal unavailable as a demonstration of coercive power. That in fact, the regime is actually worried about the potential persuasive content of easy access to international news. And then the second, in the same theme, the enormous effort that China devotes to controlling the information content on its own internet, but even more globally. I realize you can see all this as just more evidence of capacity to dominate and intimidate. But the fact that China is so sensitive to what gets said about it around the world, and as I understand it, tries to buy up Chinese language media around the world that serves Chinese expat communities, that pressures foreign governments when they say things China don't like. Those are not, in many cases, groups that are subject to the coercive authority of China. And nonetheless, China seems extraordinarily concerned about the information environment in which its own citizens, especially those who have a international orientation, and the rest of the world sees China. That seems to be a little outside the scope of the things you emphasize, but maybe I've misinterpreted.
So thank you. That's a really important question. And our approach to that is guided by something. So I think there was a very revealing quote by Joseph Goebbels, the architect of Nazi Germany's propaganda apparatus. And what he wrote in this book, very long book that he wrote about his propaganda strategy, was that when he was crafting propaganda for the German public, he had to make it as relatively objective as possible. What we see as the honest propaganda world, because he wrote, if he contained too many obvious falsehoods, German readers would simply read foreign news, right? So I think that that sort of explains to some extent, or sort of at least conditions, how we try to think about this issue. So namely, in a pure autocracy like China, the regime takes a lot of effort to sort of restrict the information space so that only regime media is available. So in particular in China, I mean, all media outlets have to be at least 51% owned by the government in the domestic press. And a lot of foreign sources are extremely restricted, particularly for domestic citizens. And that's very different than China's propaganda strategy abroad, where you see somewhere like the China Daily that's distributed in the United States. There, I mean, one of my favorite examples for teaching undergraduates is that you can read a lot of China Daily articles that do seem relatively objective, that are sort of adopting this honest propaganda approach. But every so often you'll see something like this one amazing article that was published in 2010 or 2011 that claimed that Tiananmen Square massacre was a myth. So you do see, because when China is sort of marketing its propaganda to foreigners who do have access to more objective propaganda sources, it is forced to use honest propaganda in its external propaganda strategy, which is very different than the propaganda strategy it employs at home. Brett, do you want to?
Yeah, and just hop in. So, so one of the things, so we have a model, a formal model in chapter 2, which is the theory chapter, and so one of the key results that comes out of that is that, just as you mentioned, access to information sort of ends up moderating, ends up kind of increasing honest propaganda, i.e., sort of increases the ratio of damaging sort of failures, damaging concessions, but only in places where electoral constraints are relatively binding, right? So in a place like Congo, Russia would be sort of another good example. Places where the regime's hold on power rests to some extent on persuading citizens of regime merits. Then whenever those citizens have more access to information, the regime is kind of forced to kind of moderate the propaganda strategy to kind of retain credibility. But then the argument in a place like China is that since propaganda is kind of principally a signal of the regime's capacity for violence, like then the access to information doesn't really affect that. And I guess I would also just kind of distinguish between censorship, right, which we kind of be kind of blocking the Wall Street Journal for instance from hotels, with the domestic propaganda strategy, and certainly we would sort of never argue that. I mean, I think it's clearly the case that the CCP has goes to extraordinary lengths to kind of censor citizens' informational environments, to sort of kind of block access to foreign news. But kind of given, in our view, the CCP's propaganda strategy is kind of really about kind of this kind of signaling, right? And so kind of consequently, it's not particularly sensitive, as we showed in some of the graphs earlier, the Erin showed in some of the graphs earlier, to expanding access to information.
Justin, you want to jump in here? I've got some more questions. But
yeah, I do. I think it's closely related to what you're asking. And it must be another question that you get all the time. I'm just curious about how social media censorship ties into this sort of control of the information environment. My understanding from the social media work is that China is much more willing to allow contrarian information to exist on social media platforms than what appears to be happening in its press. And I'm curious why, certainly as a sort of like signaling mechanism, why they would allow one place to have this sort of other information, but in the official propaganda, they'd be much more restrictive.
Yeah, so great question. So two responses to that. One is that there's this amazing data set that was sort of recently released. You might know about digital democracy, and these like amazing cross-national variables on sort of social media use and sort of government censorship of social media. And it's just like a wonderful data gathering project. And so we were able, sort of as a robustness check, to like merge in all of that data and to control for what we know cross-nationally about the use of social media and government censorship of social media in particular. So our results are robust at taking that into account. But I think a better, sort of more nuanced answer to your question with China specifically is that we have that sort of wonderful paper by Kingpin and Roberts a few years ago that looked at censorship, and it found that the government is willing to sort of allow criticism of the regime, and what it takes down is called social collective action. And I think that if you ran that experiment again today, you would not get the same results. I think there's a lot more evidence now, sort of anecdotally, that posts that are critical of the regime are being taken down. So I think one really good example of that, related to what we're talking about in the Uyghur repression, is that the China Digital Times is this wonderful NGO that monitors censorship in China. And what they sort of every year they release the top 10 most censored terms. And one of the things that was most censored this past year was Han citizens who were calling for supporting the Uyghurs. So I do think that you do see much more restrictive management of the social media space today than you did in the Hu Jintao administration, which is consistent for the rest of the trends that we find, and sort of the way that China scholars look now at the Hu Jintao years is sort of like amazing era that was a lot more open than the China that we see today. Brett, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I suppose I would also just say that I think, you know, some of the kind of the social media criticism literature is kind of the argument is partly that it's about kind of monitoring local officials, right? So as a way to kind of overcome the agency problem, and we think that, you know, that must be correct to some extent. But again, we would distinguish kind of that kind of monitoring device from the regime's propaganda strategy in its flagship newspaper, right? So I think one of the things that's really distinctive about the CCP's media landscape is in some sense like just how kind of fragmented it is, right? I mean, the CCP maintains a series of commercial newspapers, which many of which, you know, we gained access to, and you know, in those you know, kind of coverage of, you know, the economy or kind of non-governmental topics is actually, you know, reasonably, I don't want to say objective, but sort of like much less effusive. Whereas coverage of the government in those is every bit as effusive as in kind of the flagship newspaper, right? And so, you know, our argument really is that, you know, citizens kind of, you know what's going on. They kind of see this you know, effusive language, and it's precisely that effusive language attached to the government, and in particular in the flagship newspaper that is kind of doing this signaling about the regime's capacity for violence.
Can I just add one other really quick thing? So one thing that we sort of documented historically is another thing that Joseph Goebbels wrote about in that book of propaganda was the importance of what he called black propaganda, which is using citizens who are hired to sort of say the same thing that the regime wants them to say. And the power of that type of propaganda was you couldn't attribute the source, right? So you can sort of, as a dictator, if you're in a constrained autocracy, you can create the illusion of popular support for your policies if you're sort of paying citizens to say what you want. What's interesting is that China uses that strategy a great deal. So there's a ton of what's called astroturfing, sort of promoting the regime line. Molly Roberts has some fantastic work on that. But that's another strategy is that we see sort of this flooding of the information space as well online. So it's just, you know, so it's, I think that the autocracies in general and China specifically are really taking advantage of some of these other techniques that are, you know, historical in nature. I mean, we have this one great quote in the introduction about how the, you know, a historical pope was giving a speech and planted people in the audience to say, God wills it, whenever he was making important points. So these are old techniques, but things that we see magnified in the social media era as well.
Sorry, and if I can, if I can just add something that that Erin said made me think of some other work that's that we have that's kind of in progress. So kind of another one of the things that's distinctive about the CCP's media landscape is that, you know, everything is you know, all outlets are basically government owned, at least sort of 51%. You know, in other, you know, autocracies around the world, you know, where to some extent they're kind of forced to kind of you know, abide you know, independent media outlets. One of the very kind of common techniques would be to or is to maintain basically kind of like unofficial propaganda outlets with obscured ownership. Anyway, which so it's kind of a, you know, again, kind of a way to kind of, you know, foster uncertainty about you know, who the author of propaganda is. And I think that, again, that's, I think, kind of particularly common in places where honest propaganda is most salient due to relatively binding electoral constraints.
Can I take you back to your evidence that China is using propaganda to intimidate? And, you know, one of your key pieces of evidence in this regard was the timing of regime newspaper coverage of the Uyghur threat, as they would characterize it, around Tiananmen Square massacre and so on. So there's clearly an element of that in the little clip you showed. But I wonder, is there also a persuasion aspect to it as well? And let me articulate what I mean by that. I can imagine that in the context of China's history, an argument that has some currency is that the only real alternative in the Chinese context to a strong central hand with coercive power is chaos and violence. So we're just going to remind you that that's the alternative to our heavy-handed approach, chaos and violence. And when would you want to remind people of that? Well, around the times that they might coalesce and protest against the regime. That's an alternative interpretation to the one you advanced. Maybe you can rule that interpretation out, but can you?
Yeah, so that's a really important counter argument. So we really did want to try to address that specifically with our survey questions. So we had 2 questions to test that. So first, we asked people, do you approve the government's policies in Xinjiang? And there was no movement in the list experiments about approval. So there's really no evidence that people, those articles convince people the government is doing a good job and you support them. What we wanted to test also was levels of anti-Uyghur racism. So we asked, so there's a really famous list experiment that sort of kicked off the field in 1997, Kuklinski et al. And so it was trying to assess like the spread of the New South. And it asked people in a list experiment context whether they would be angry if a Black family moved next door. And it found that I think 41% of American white Southerners would be angry. So it estimated that level of racism in the American South in the 90s. So we wanted to do something similar that was appropriate for the Chinese context. So like the single family house thing is really appropriate in many parts of urban China. So what we asked was, would you prefer not to do business? Would you prefer not to patronize a Uyghur-owned business? We thought that was like a reasonable analog. And what we found was that so in a list experiment context, around 20% of Chinese citizens, had that racism against Uyghurs. However, there was no movement on that level of racism that was triggered by the People's Daily treatment. So we didn't see movement in racism or in approval of government policies. So we think that, let us know if you find that convincing, but we think that suggests, people are responding to this cue and being persuaded.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. The only other thing that comes to mind is content analysis of the articles themselves. Do they contain language that seems more along the lines of the argument I sketched and trying to persuade people? You highlighted the intimidation language, which was clearly there in pretty powerful form. And I'm just wondering whether there's other content in those articles and is trying to do the same thing. So we've got some questions, and some of them are highly focused. Maybe I'll just read them and probably call for short responses, but you can decide. One from Thomas Spitters. Is not the media and CCP in China more reactive in its approach to persuasion, repression, and its repressive environment for everyone, not just those involved politically and administratively?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Yeah, so the People's Daily is, that's the flagship outlet that we looked at. We looked at a number of commercial outlets that are, people think they're broadly distributed. We did sort of run, and I think Peter Leo had a question about this too. So we wanted to gauge readership levels of various outlets, both the People's Daily, other core regime outlets, different, well-known regional outlets, as well as China's, commercial press and some of its financial publications that have done the best issues or best reporting on scandals and crises. So what we find is that, broadly speaking, across this whole huge media spectrum, which we've tried to sample representative outlets from, you do see divergence in overall valence, right? So the more objective or commercial outlets in general, if you look at all of their coverage, they're less effusive, less positive. But if you focus on the coverage that we think is most important, which is coverage of the regime, they're all extremely similar to the People's Daily. So we do see this broad-based approach that targets really all these different media segments and different audiences. They follow the People's Daily line in matters where it counts.
Great. And another one, this is kind of more on the technical side, but someone, Samir Borwanker, is curious about the data. How are the many languages handled? And he specifically references the case of India, which, in which there are many languages in common use. He says, are they translated by NLP techniques? So maybe, there's a lot of technical, maybe you can point to the right direction for people who want to know how to handle multiple languages in this kind of NLP project. You have some tips for that?
Yeah, this was, and Brett, please jump in. This is a really fun aspect of the project. So we didn't machine translate anything in this project. These are all in the native languages. And so what we did is we took two approaches. One, in the cross-national models, we really wanted to be sensitive to potential linguistic differences. So what we translated was we carefully translated the dictionaries to measure tone when we were doing some dictionary-based semantic analysis, and then applied each of those well-translated dictionaries to the native language corpus. But more broadly, I think the approach that we liked the best was that we did a lot of supervised learning models to, identify topics that were common across newspapers. We always have implemented the supervised learning models within language. So we'll have, a French model to, identify government action in the French newspapers, same thing in Chinese, so on and so forth. We were restricted by available, libraries and packages for languages. So we limited our focus in this book to like the 6 major world languages. We didn't look at different Indian languages, for example. We didn't look at Persian or Farsi. So we were limited in that sense, but that was also sort of, it felt like a reasonable limitation in terms of a broad cross-national approach. When we did dabble in machine translations, we found that they didn't work very well. And that's part of why we stayed away from that this project. Brett, do you want to add?
Yeah. I suppose I would just say that, avoiding machine translation to the extent that, or minimizing our reliance on machine translation to the extent that we could, was super, super critical. So I guess, the most kind of practical, tip, I suppose, when it came to, training sets, it basically, doing the training sets were like the only thing that we really translated for the topic model, save for the valence dictionaries that Erin was referring to.
Let me raise another issue. You talked about the role of coercion or demonstration of ability to dominate, and kind of propaganda in the sense of the subject of constraints. What you didn't mention, it seems to me part of the overall mix of why the two can work well together is they're complementary in the following sense. So I noticed, for example, this is just casual observations over many years of teaching students, so take it for what it's worth, that students who ambitious professionals who come from autocratic societies seem to demonstrate more indifference and less interest in certain topics that are politically sensitive, because it would be not only professionally inconvenient, maybe professional suicide, but dangerous to their own security and that of their family to invest too much effort in learning and thinking about certain topics. So in other words, the coercion side or the domination side also discourages people from letting their beliefs and views go in certain directions, and encourages them to channel it along directions that the regime wants them to. In that sense, there seems to be the two strategies that you outlined seem to be very much complements, and would be used hand in hand. And I guess that's how I see China, for example. But I didn't hear you articulate that argument. I heard your argument is that they're more like additive, or you use different ones in different electoral settings, but they seem to me to be connected in a complementary set that I just described.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think that in some sense, one could almost think of that as almost like it's sort of an interactive thing, right? Where the CCP kind of relies on its flagship propaganda apparatus to kind of like to do the signaling, right, of the repressive capacity, and then kind of citizens in some sense, sort of like foreclose, right, a set of beliefs from themselves.
Exactly.
And so, you know, it could be, and so then, you know, maybe they're inclined to find, for instance, you know, so I like it, and then so it's quite possible that they could find, you know, kind of the more kind of moderated content, you know, the kind of moderated non-governmental content in the commercial newspapers reasonably persuasive, right? Because in some sense, like they kind of select that for themselves. And I would say that like we that must be to some extent the case, right? I mean, you know, in this book, we were really kind of focused on, you know, kind of the propaganda strategy in the flagship newspaper. But I think one of the really exciting directions for future research is that, you know, we know that there are kind of, you know, we know that there are multiple propaganda outlets, right? We know that in some sense, like the market for propaganda is fragmented. So in China, you know, there are kind of the commercial newspapers that sit alongside the flagship, you know, the People's Daily, you know, in kind of more in autocracies with, you know, more kind of nominally democratic institutions, you know, then kind of the flagship propaganda newspapers will sit alongside kind of the unofficial newspapers with like obfuscated ownership, right? Which I mentioned earlier. Anyway, so I think that you know, focusing on kind of precise, like in some sense, like the different functions of these kind of fragmented propaganda markets is a really, really exciting direction for future research. In this case, we didn't do that primarily because, you know, collecting the flagship propaganda newspapers was a lot already, but it must be the case, I would imagine, that there's this sort of interactive effect in China in particular. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic direction.
I mean, one way to explore this, it's not using the same your current research methods, but you would expect a different, if you temporarily put someone from an autocratic society into a free information society, that they would respond differently in their efforts to learn things that are hard to learn at home, depending on the extent of their fear about the consequences of letting their thoughts go in a different direction than the regime wants them to. So that suggests you would see perhaps a greater effort to inform oneself better if you come from an autocratic regime that's subject to electoral constraints and more limited state ability to dominate your life than if you come from you know, a dictatorship that, or a totalitarian regime that's controlling essentially, you know, all aspects of your life. If you get out of line, and you will be punished. I don't know whether there's any evidence on how, say, graduate students avail themselves of an information-rich society when they spend 5 years in the United States relative to their home country, but I'd be quite keen to just understand what the differences are in those population groups and whether it relates to the extent and the effectiveness of the repressive apparatus in the home country.
Yeah, so it's a really good and important question, I think. So there isn't work that I'm aware of sort of students and surveying them about their beliefs and how they change differentially. There is really good work on what happens when you give Chinese citizens access to VPNs, though. So I'm thinking, and it's kind of conflicting too. So Molly Roberts has a working paper, it may have been published by now, and also a part of her book where she looks at, this is with a co-author, whose name I don't remember, unfortunately, sorry, who give VPN access to a series of individuals and see how their behavior changes. What she finds is that people do browse more, but they are not necessarily going out to seek out the political information. There's conflicting work, though. I think David Yang, assistant professor in econ at Harvard, has some work on this too, where he does find that people go out and look for conflicting political information. But I'll find those two papers and I'll put the links in the chat box.
Great, Justin, did you have more?
Yeah, I have one more sort of like high level thing, and then when we break, I have a bunch of questions on the text. So the high level thing is thinking about the survey results, and the sort of preferred interpretation, and I think it's the interpretation I would make, is that in some instances propaganda is not effective because the marginal sort of piece of propaganda isn't moving people. An alternative interpretation could be that propaganda is incredibly effective. In fact, so effective that the marginal piece of propaganda isn't going to move someone because they're sort of immersed in it constantly. And so I'm just curious if you've thought about, or if it's feasible to do something almost like either a deprivation study where you sort of convince some Chinese citizens to not consume certain pieces of propaganda. The alternative to that, if that's not feasible, is to incentivize a lot more overall consumption, not just the marginal piece, but say, we're going to pay you to subscribe to an RSS feed that we can then monitor your consumption of this. Because I think that would help get around this sort of, the tricky thing with thinking about like the marginal message versus the overall propaganda effort.
Justin, I think that's like a great question. I think it's, and I suppose, Erin, like we definitely think of propaganda as sort of creating a kind of a world in which people live, right? And so then like the idea is that we sort of we wouldn't expect to see any kind of like marginal results because like they're kind of immersed in this world, and so of course we don't see any effect of a single piece because they sort of already believe it. Now I suppose the idea of the deprivation study I think is really, really fascinating, and actually this is something I think that we would like to talk more about with you. But I suppose our response would be that well, I guess one response would be that we do see a marginal effect like pretty consistently of the fear result, right? And we see that marginally, and we find that marginal effect in both the People's Daily and and in the commercial newspapers whenever they kind of run kind of the same kind of like very effusive kind of government kind of content. So I mean, it seems so I would think that kind of if your suggestion was really what was going on, then I don't think that we would see kind of the strength of the marginal effect for the fear result that we that we obviously don't do when it comes to kind of the more kind of kind of CCP support results. But yeah, I mean, I think that we definitely but I really like the idea of the deprivation study. That's something that we should talk more about, I think. Erin, did you want to add?
Sorry about that. I was busy pasting the links into the chat box there. But I think those are really fantastic ideas, Justin. And I think that going in that direction will be really interesting. I mean, this is actually a topic that I've been like puzzling a lot about, because I think there are three literatures that are kind of touch points. One is the literature in American politics, which shows that American campaign advertisements have these pretty substantively serious effects, but for very short amount of times. They fade after 3 days or so. And that's what we estimate also in our chapter about autocratic propaganda and protest. We find that it affects, it decreases protest rates for about as long as American political advertisements, change voters' views. But then there's this sort of medium-run literature by this, Cantoni et al. That you have the, persistent propaganda can change views over the long term. And then I think like the third literature I think about is really this one paper, a working paper that was presented by a postdoc at CDDRL this year, which is really fascinating and sort of changed how I think about things. Brett, do you remember his name?
No, I'm not sure what paper.
No, okay, sorry. Well, so some unnamed brilliant postdoc has this paper that shows that in Indonesia, people who are studying to take the civil service exam. They basically, if they fail,
I think he's a pre-doc actually.
Pre-doc, okay.
He's a grad student. He's a grad student here. It was a really nice paper on civil service bureaucracy exams in Indonesia. Justin, you might actually know what we're referring to.
Okay.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay. Anyway. Okay, well, I'll find his name too in the chat box. But so the point of the paper was that people who studied really hard for the civil service exam and failed it developed these like long-term negative views about the quality of democracy and government and civil society in Indonesia. And the idea was basically the more engagement you have with propaganda or some sort of information over time, the more persistent the change of your views and behavior is. So I don't know, that's how I sort of think about this, but I think like implementing that more seriously in China would be really interesting. So thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, this is honestly, Justin, this is something that I think that we've both really struggled with in kind of the experimental work to try to understand its effects, right? Like Yeah, I mean that it just must be the case that there's kind of this kind of like cumulative effect over time, right? There's something about kind of growing up, coming of age, always having kind of lived in a certain informational environment, which must kind of condition. And everything that we've done has always been kind of marginal, like marginal in the sense of kind of treatment or or propaganda spikes. So, for instance, in one of the later chapters, Erin mentioned, whenever we try to estimate the effect of propaganda on protests, it's always about propaganda spikes or on threat spikes, for instance, right? Whenever the CCP kind of uses threat code words, the same way that the Rwandan government uses genocide or whatever. Again, it's a threat code word. So everything that we've done to try to measure its effects has always been this kind of marginal thing, and in some sense, that's, I think we've been doing that because like we don't really have a good way to kind of like measure the kind of cumulative, like the fact of just kind of living in a certain information space for one's entire life. But that's I think that we would love to do that, so we'd love to talk more about that.
And Nick Kuipers is the grad student.
Thanks. Okay, let's see if we got any other open questions. Got one more from John here. Let me read it. John Metelsky. Do you think that the influence of information technology permeating new generations worldwide, plus the growing nation state appetite for space exploration, will blur the influence of any one terrestrial nation state to pursue your kind of propagandistic strategy? Maybe another way to put that is are there aspects of globalization that are constraining or influencing how autocratic regimes can conduct their propaganda exercises? There was a time when people thought the internet would make life miserable for autocrats. That hasn't proved to be the case. But
exactly. So I mean, one of my favorite examples of this, right? I think 10 or 12 years ago, the internet was the internet was a liberation technology, and I think a senior official in the W. Bush administration like suggested somewhat seriously that like Twitter be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize and the like, right? And now we're kind of entering this age of postmodern totalitarianism, right? Where the CCP is sort of pioneering its Safe Cities initiative, with 46,000 surveillance cameras in and around Beijing. So there's kind of clearly been, I think, a change in how we view the internet as a force for political change around the world. And I suppose like, I think our prediction, right, would be that, insofar as the expansion of digital surveillance and perhaps also, the recession of international pressure for governments to abide their citizens, basic rights. I think, as that international pressure begins to recede, I think that we would expect, frankly, propaganda to become more effusive in more countries over time. So I think, to some extent, I think that we would expect quite the contrary now of of this notion of information will kind of free us all. I think now quite the contrary. Propaganda strategies will become much more effusive. That'd be my prediction.
Great. Okay, so what's useful to be reminded that it wasn't that long ago when Twitter was a candidate for a Nobel Peace Prize, how quickly things can change.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this has all happened in the space of like 15 years or so, right?
Right.
The internet was going to free us all, and clearly, I think at this point it seems pretty. At this point, I think the world's autocracies are figuring out, in particular in Beijing, how to use these digital technologies for monitoring and for repression, and so I think to the extent that they in some sense sort of outpace the capacity for internet technologies to mobilize protests, yeah, our prediction is that propaganda will become much more effective over time.
Great, thank you. Any last words? I do want to remind the audience, you guys have a forthcoming book, Propaganda in Autocracies. It's the title, right? And it's coming out later this year, I believe. Okay, so we can all keep our eyes open for it.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much. That was a fascinating presentation and discussion. So we're going to turn the recording off. We're going to go to an unrecorded session. I know there's, I think Justin has some more, and there's at least one other person who wants to jump in with kind of more kind of detailed questions. So thanks very much. And we'll see you on the other side of turning the recording button off.
Sounds good. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much for having us. Thank you, everybody.